At last, a voice for people who pay big government's bills, not those who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to this week's broadcast. And on Speaking of Taxpayers, we're going to think about the old phrase, actions speak louder than words. Well, what kind of actions are we talking about? We're talking about roll call votes in the United States Congress, where the rubber meets the road, where the taxpayers are affected most, and we have the most accurate and complete method of measuring how each individual member of Congress does on fiscal policy votes. It is called the National Taxpayers Union Rating of Congress.
We just released our 2008 rating, which took a look at every roll call vote affecting fiscal policy in the second session of the 110th Congress. So that was all of 2008. We scored 286 votes this year, 182 in the House, and 104 votes in the Senate. And we weight each vote according to importance of how much it would affect taxpayers, and then assign members of Congress a taxpayer score that reflects his or her commitment to reducing or controlling federal spending, taxes, debt, and regulation. And this year's rating came up with some interesting findings. We'll start with some good news, which is for the sixth consecutive year, Congressman Jeff Flake of Arizona was the top scorer in the House with a 98% rating. This year, he's tied Congressman Ron Paul's record of 6 first-place finishes from 1979 through 1984.
So Ron Paul and Jeff Flake are now even with each other, although there is still one edge left with Ron Paul. He has the all-time number one highest rating score of 99%, 1 point higher than Jeff Flake has been able to get so far.
And in the Senate, Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina captured first place for the third year in a row with a 96% rating. So congratulations to Senator DeMint and Congressman Flake for their strong commitment to defending taxpayers year after year. They vote consistently, they're very principled, and we thank them for all of their work.
Yes, and while this rating cannot capture anything but votes on fiscal policy, both these gentlemen are leaders in other ways. They are constantly sponsoring amendments, speaking up against things like earmarks, leading filibusters in the Senate. So this goes beyond mere roll call votes. Their Taxpayers' Friend Awards are probably the most deserved in the entire Congress, thanks not only to their voting records, but their leadership.
And now on to some not so good news. Our 2008 rating also saw the highest ever number of big spenders in Congress. Those are members of Congress who received grades of F for scoring 25% or less in the House and 14% or less in the Senate. In 2008, a record 267 members of Congress captured the title of Big Spender.
Although we've been issuing this rating since 1979 under its current methodology, we only began giving grades to lawmakers in 1992. Well, between 1992 and 2008, we have had no Republican senators get an F grade until 2008 in the form of Olympia Snowe of Maine.
Also, on the House side, 2 Republican congressmen became the first to receive F grades in a decade. Former Congressman Ray LaHood of Illinois and former Congressman Wayne Gilchrist of Maryland.
You may remember Ray LaHood was in line for a possible cabinet post with the Obama administration. Maybe now we know exactly why he was a favorite pick of the Democratic White House.
Something we want to emphasize about our rating is that unlike other organizations, we don't only focus on a handful of equally weighted key votes, but we look at every roll call vote that affects fiscal policy, appropriations, authorization, and tax bills, budget target resolutions, amendments, and certain procedural votes that could affect the burden on taxpayers.
And it's important to remember, Natasha was reading off some of these statistics about big spenders and taxpayers' friends. Again, in order to be a big spender, you had to score worse than a 25% in the House or 15% in the Senate. That's a heck of a grading curve. Look at the other end of the scale. You only had to score an 80% to be a taxpayer's friend and get an A in the House, 76% in the Senate. Now, in any classroom in America, those would be B grades. In any classroom in America for an F grade, you'd be looking at 50% or less. Unfortunately, because the average score in the Senate is 32, the average in the House is 36, we would have to flunk most of Congress if we were using a traditional grade scale.
Fortunately, there are still members of Congress who are strong taxpayer allies. In addition to Congressman Flake and Senator DeMint, 46 other members of Congress earned scores high enough to receive a letter grade of A and a Taxpayer's Friend Award.
Interestingly, too, this is not necessarily a scorecard that simply beats up on Democrats and lauds Republicans. As we mentioned earlier, we had some Republican F-grade recipients, but a lot of Republicans with very mediocre grades in the C's and the D's. You look in the United States Senate, for example, you have Ted Stevens with a D. You have Gordon Smith with a D. Norm Coleman with a D. Look at the C minuses and the C's. You've got Kit Bond, Mel Martinez, Johnny Isaacson. These folks are supposed to be fiscal conservatives, and yet they're scoring at a pretty mediocre level. Again, we're talking on a real curve here. To get a C, you had to score a 50% or better. That should not be a very difficult thing, especially for a Republican to achieve, but it really shows up in the averages. The typical Republican in the House voted on behalf of taxpayers about 2/3 of the time. In the Senate, a little more than half the time. That has to be improved if we are to see lower taxes and smaller government. And the Democrats, although their averages are now starting to creep up, still generally remain in the single-digit scores. That has to change too.
Pete was mentioning what the average pro-taxpayer scores among Republicans in the House and Senate were, and they actually dropped this year from 2007. Among House Republicans, it dropped 4 points to 65%, and Senate Republicans' score plummeted 9 points from 66% in 2007 to 57% in 2008.
So very clearly trying to run toward the center or the middle or whatever mushy moderate status the general media would have you believe is the right thing for America didn't work for Republicans. They continued to lose seats in 2008, worse than 2006. I don't know who it was who said this, but the middle of the road is for dead armadillos. And it certainly seems to be the same for politicians who want to lose their election.
Among state delegations, Nebraska representatives turned in the highest average pro-taxpayer score of 67%, while Oklahoma and Wyoming topped out in the Senate, both at 80% for taxpayer scores. On the other end of the scale, New Jersey posted the worst average in the Senate with 2%, and Rhode Island bottomed out in the House with a state average of 7%.
Isn't that an incredible thing when you think about it? How can you have so little concern for taxpayers on so many votes? Again, we're talking about more than 100 votes in the Senate, almost 200 votes in the House. How can you get a 2%? It means you have to vote against virtually every piece of tax relief, even for the poor, which Democrats claim to care about. You have to vote for virtually every major spending boost, even in defense, which again, Democrats claim they want to trim. Those folks who get single-digit scores really are working overtime against taxpayers. It's not something you do by sitting back and just not voting the right way. You have to actively vote the wrong way.
Well, we're just about running out of time for this week's edition of The Taxpayer's Turn. You can view our complete rating in PDF format online at www.ntu.org. You can also search a database from 1992 through 2000 by looking up members of Congress by last name. And you can also view lists of this year's Taxpayers Friend Award winners in both chambers, the House and Senate. Again, that's on our website, ntu.org. Everything about this year's rating is there.
And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, we'll talk a little bit about the outrage of the week. But before we even do that, we need to set this in context. Earlier in the week, Defense Secretary Robert Gates unveiled a new defense budget plan that will de-emphasize some of the old Cold War weapons systems and produce budget savings that can be redirected elsewhere and perhaps reapplied to reduce the budget deficit, something very much on the minds of taxpayers considering it will soar to over $1 trillion. $1 trillion deficit, folks, maybe even $1.5 trillion deficit within the next year. We've got to do something to trim back the spending. And even though we all support a strong military, we're all in favor of national security, our economic security is a component of that national security. And having a strong economy means having a limited government sector, having a government that takes less from people, that spends less, that borrows less. And a government that spends less has to concentrate on spending less across the board, including defense. Secretary Gates unveiled a plan that has several NTU recommendations on its list, including stopping production of the F-22 Raptor fighter, an excellent aircraft, but one that has absolutely no peer in the skies and is so expensive that we're better off buying other multi-capable aircraft. We will have air superiority from the number of Raptors we've got now, at least for the foreseeable future. Secretary Gates is saying we're going to stop the buy as is. He's canceling the DDG 1000 program. What does that alphabet soup mean? It is called the DDG 1000 because it is a Navy destroyer that they want to build. Well, they, being members of Congress, are the ones wanting to build it because they want to give lucrative shipyard contracts, but the Navy itself has said this program just isn't worth it anymore. It is over budget and behind schedule. There are cheaper, better ships actually coming up behind this one that can probably be built in the same time frame. So DDG 1000 is out. There are lots and lots of other programs that Gates named that we can get a lot of taxpayer savings from, but one we have not heard about yet is the so-called F-35 strike fighter. I speak here not of the fighter itself, but one of its components, the engine. You see, the Lockheed Martin Corporation won the competition for the F-35 fighter. They are the contractor, and Pratt & Whitney is the subcontractor for building the engine. Well, the winner of that competition didn't sit very well with some members of Congress who have General Electric, another engine maker, in their own home districts and states. So guess what? They're deciding we can't do with just one engine for this fighter. We've got to build two. We have to have two separate supply lines, two separate designs, all in the name of competition. They're missing the boat, folks. The competition has already been held for the fighter, Lockheed Martin and its subcontractor won. Why do we have to have a whole different supply line and all the costs associated with that? Why indeed? Hopefully, the Obama administration, which has expressed doubts over having to build a second engine and have a second supply line, will stick by its guns. If it does, we're talking about a whole lot of budget savings, perhaps $4 or $5 billion, depending on how the program goes. In any case, even if this second engine is built, the prospect of savings through competition is very dubious. It may turn out to be a wash. It may turn out to be much worse because we'll have to maintain these supply lines and different personnel and different tools, and the engine itself may not prove to be as reliable as the one that Pratt & Whitney is already building. So this deserves the outrage of the month until members of Congress do something about it, and the Pentagon does something about it, and the White House does something about it and says one engine is enough. Taxpayers have bought an engine already. They don't need another one. So how's that for the outrage of the week, folks? It's very strange. It sounds strange, but it's a lot of money, and it's in the Defense Department, something we may all know and love. But even in the Pentagon, there's a whole lot of money being wasted. and we need to look there for savings. And now that you're sufficiently angered, we have to give you an outlet for that anger. And boy, we've got a great one. It's called the National Taxpayers Conference, coming up here in the Washington, D.C. area, June 11th through 13th. Isn't that correct, Natasha?
That's correct, Pete. National Taxpayers Conference 2009 will take place June 11th through 13th at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, just outside the nation's capital. It'll include nuts and bolts seminars on running a taxpayer group, in-depth panels on trends in the taxpayer revolt, and also other practical sessions such as media training, how to effectively use social media, fundraising, and loads of other things.
And we are filling up a whole lineup of superstars as we speak, including former Comptroller General David Walker, who is now running the Fiscal Wake Up Tour, trying to get Americans engaged on the most pressing fiscal issue of our time, the uncontrolled growth of entitlements. They literally will swamp the federal budget, cause tax rates to increase 90% across the board in the space of 4 decades unless we act now. We also have former Ohio Treasurer and Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, who has a great deal of experience crafting constitutional measures to limit spending and taxes. Vital things, we see those in over a dozen states in America today. Those states are in some of the best financial circumstances in this rotten economy as there can be. We've also got former Missouri Governor Matt Blunt, who is an expert on the so-called transparency movement. He issued an executive order requiring the state to reveal to the details contracts, grants, expenditures, all in a searchable database that taxpayers could see right on the internet. They could actually dial in or type in all kinds of search terms and find out what their state government is spending their tax dollars on. A true innovation, and he's a true leader in the movement. But you're only going to hear this combination of folks. You're only going to see this great combination of panels. You're only going to experience this great combination of veteran taxpayer activists ready to help you through National Taxpayers Conference, which is why you've got to make your reservations now. Isn't that correct, Natasha?
Yes, if you go to NTU's website, www.ntu.org, you'll be able to get hotel information, register for the conference, see the latest on speakers and exhibitors, and also just stay up to date on the latest conference news. So once again, that's ntu.org. You can register now. Our early bird rate is expiring soon. It's $99. You'll also be able to get hotel information. You can call the Hyatt or visit their website to reserve a room. We have a special conference rate, so make sure to make a note of that. So hurry up and register today for National Taxpayers Conference 2009.
And for those of us at Speaking of Taxpayers, have a happy and blessed Easter and Passover season. We hope you enjoyed this broadcast. We hope you'll visit ntu.org, sign up for that great conference. You won't regret it. In closing, remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And you do that through listening to Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm Pete Sepp.
And